All right, Algebra 2 people, here is your practice exam 2, the calculator version. It's going to be a little bit rearranged. I'm putting all the graphing on one side and all the right triangle trig stuff on the back side. So same problems, just things are in a little bit different order. And okay, cleaning things up. So we're going to start off with the graphing. So to start off, remember you're going to be comparing all your graphing to this. Da, 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 da. All right. So I always like to make a list. I also took away the grid because you won't have a grid on the test. So you want to make sure you know how to label your axes correctly. So notice in this first number 1, the C value, which is your new sinusoidal axis, is -1. So you want to label your axis, and I'm going to give myself a little line to mark off my new axis. My amplitude is 3, which means I'm going to come up 3 units to 2 and down 3 units to a -4. And so I'm going to kind of mark off my high and my low in between that. So there's where my graph is going to fall. And we know that D is 0, which means I'm going to start on the y-axis somewhere. And my period, since B is 1, is just going to be a traditional 2 pi. So we're here at 0. I'm going to end at 2 pi. Half that distance is pi. And then I half it again, so pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And so now I'm ready to draw my graph. So a cosine, remember regular cosine starts high and ends high. So I am going to start here at 2. I'm going to hit my sinusoidal at pi over 2, my low at pi, 3 pi over 2 back up, and end at 2 pi. And once you do your 5 dots, whoops, try and hit the actual dots. So I want to come back through here and then come through there. All right, so that would be your graph. And you don't need to do anything more if you just label the pieces that you want. Okay, the next one, notice my C is going to be 0, so I'm going to stay on the x-axis as the middle of my graph. My amplitude will be 2. My D value, where I start on the x-axis, is going to be -pi. It's always the opposite of what's in the parentheses. And my period is still, since the B value here is 1, is still 2 pi, because that's 2 pi over 1. So I'm starting, so let me mark off my amplitude. So I know I'm going to go up to 2. I know I'm going to go down to a -2. So I'll kind of just draw a little border to show that I'm going to fall within there. Now I need to label my x-axis. So I'm going to be starting back at -pi. So I'm going to start way back here. That means this would be a -pi over 2. This is 0. So I have to scrunch it in a little bit more. And this would be pi. So it's going to take me from -pi over 2 to pi, because that is a distance of 2 pi. That's how long it takes me to complete one cycle. So when I do the graph, we have a sinusoidal. Sinusoidal starts in the middle, then goes up, and then comes back. So it's like a sideways S. So I'm going to start right here at -pi. At -pi over 2, I go up. At 0, I'm back here. My low is at pi over 2, and I'm going to finish at pi, so that your graph is going to look like that. All right, now we have back to another cosine graph. So let's label what we have. Our sinusoidal now has moved up to 2. So here we are at 2, and my amplitude is at 2. So I'm going to go up to 4 and down to 0. So in terms of my border, the high is at 4, my low is going to be the x-axis, and my sinusoidal is going to be at 2. All right, my d value is 0, so I'll start on the y-axis somewhere, but now my period has changed. So 2 pi divided by pi over 6, well, that's 2 pi times invert and multiply. Notice the pi's cancel is going to be a distance of 12. All right, so again, make sure you're labeling your x-axis, not your sinusoidal, the new sinusoidal axis. So I know from 0, where I start, to 12, that's where I'm going to end. I need to mark off my halfway point. So halfway between those is 6. Well, halfway between 0 and 6 is 3. Halfway between 6 and 12 is 9. So notice I have those 5 points, those 5 markers on my x-axis. Now we use the fact that it's cosine, so I'm going to start at the high point, then in the middle, then at the low, then at the middle, then at the high, and just connect the dots. So if you can just label all your axes correspondingly, then it's easy enough to place the dots because they just kind of go high, middle, high, back and forth. All right, now let's turn that sideways and try and come up with the actual equation. And as I said before, I find it helpful when doing these to actually highlight one cycle. So I'm going to start here at 0 and just kind of go up and down. So that would represent one cycle, and as you can see from the graph, it looks like that would be a sine. Okay, so my amplitude is this distance. So I'm going to label some things. I know that A is 2. I see that I'm right in the middle of the x-axis, so that means C is 0. I'm starting on the y-axis, so my D is going to be 0. And I notice that it only takes me pi to finish. So if my period is pi, the B value that goes in the equation is 2 pi over that amount, that period, which simplifies to 2. Putting it all together, y equals 2 sine 2x, because C and D were both 0. Okay, let's do the next one. So again, I want to highlight. So since I'm going to highlight right here, we want to show one cycle. So notice that looks like a cosine graph, but it's upside down. So let's keep track of the fact that we're going to have a minus cosine. So in front of the amplitude, you'll have to put a minus. Now it doesn't look like I'm equally spaced around the x-axis. So let's find what that middle line is. I'm down here at a -1. My high is at 3. What's halfway between is a +1. So I know that C is going to be 1. My amplitude, which is that distance, is 2. My D value is 0. I could shift it, but you don't have to. Remember, there are equivalent answers to this. And my B value is going to be how long it takes me to complete one cycle. And it looks like it took me 10, from 0 to 10, and that would simplify to pi over 5. So putting that all together, y equals, my C value is 1. I'm going to put a minus 2 times cosine, because the minus turned your graph upside down. The B value is pi over 5, and there was no D value, so we just put times x. All right, now we're going to do the Ferris wheel problem. So let's underline the things we really need. We need the radius is 32 feet. 1 revolution is 18 seconds, which tells you your period. The lowest part is still 4 feet above the ground. And we're going to write this starting at the lowest point. So I like to give myself just a little sketch just to start it off. So the lowest place is going to be at 4. My radius is 32. So that would put me here at 36 plus another 32, which would put me here at 68. Okay, so that's doing your radius twice. 1 revolution every 18 seconds means that if I start here, your graph would look like that. So it starts low, gets to the high, comes back. All right, so let's identify what we have. That tells me that the C value is at 36 because that represents your radius right there. The amplitude is 32, that's half the distance, halfway up. And then, let's see, we have your D value is 0, you're starting on the y-axis. And the B value is going to be 2 pi divided by your period, which is 18 seconds, and that reduces to pi over 9. So this becomes y equals 36 minus, again, because it's an upside down cosine, 32 cosine pi over 9 t, since we're talking time. I'm not going to, if you put an x, that's totally fine.